Hello people, it's going to be a no thrills informative video today. I'm getting lots of questions in the comment section below and on Instagram and via email as well. So thank you very much to everyone who is asking these questions. Please keep them coming. If I don't answer immediately or soon to the time in which you send the email or whatever, it's not because I'm being ignorant, it's simply because of time budgeting, but I will get to answering the questions. Now, if one person is thinking this and asking the question, it's likely that other people are thinking the same. So what I'm going to do is to do a video today. We're going to have a look around in a chat and I'm going to be answering some questions that people have indeed asked me. So let's go. Okay, so my grape videos are always generally popular and I'm very grateful for that, and as many of you know, I'm very passionate about it. So let's have a look at this. So this is Lakemont Seedless, and as you can see, little bunches of their flowers at the moment, but they should, all being well, some of these, or hopefully most, if not all, should turn into little bunches of grapes. Now, somebody asked me, how can they get bigger grapes, basically? Well, you do get some varieties, okay, that simply are bigger grapes. The fruits are bigger, and that's how it is. You may remember I've spoken about a variety called Rhea, R-H-E-A, and I noticed the grapes make a good size, okay? Now, if you've got a vine that is producing smaller grapes, and the variety is indeed a smaller fruit variety, what you can do is remove some of the individual grapes as the bunches get bigger. So that can sometimes help. But if you want to have bigger grapes, one good piece of advice would be to purchase a vine or take a cutting from a vine that produces larger grapes generally. Now, regarding grapes in pots, so you can see here that I have this grapevine cutting that is indeed growing in this pot. Now, when growing grapes in a pot, ideally you want a 60-litre container at least. The reason for this is because the vine wants to put out as big roots as possible. In the ground they put out deep roots, so of course they want a bigger pot as possible, bigger pot container, so that they can put down some nice deep roots. Now, the general advice is to use wooden pots, okay, simply because this helps to keep the roots cool. So in general, the advice is when one is growing a grapevine in a greenhouse or a polytunnel, it's to have the rootstock base of the vine outside the polytunnel or greenhouse in the ground, and the vine to then come in, and this then helps to keep the roots cool, which grapevines are said to like. But I've never had a problem with this vine here being in the ground here, and I never actually watered this last year either. Even during that very warm spell that we had, I simply left this vine in here and there was no problem with it. But generally the advice, if you're going to grow a grapevine in a pot, is 60 litres at least, and have a wooden one. One thing that also is advised is to put some mulch around the top to keep water in. So you could maybe I would use something like sawdust because I've got plenty of it, or maybe some bark or something like that. So you can see I've got some cuttings here that are doing quite well, and these are grapevine cuttings, and these will eventually be part of a container grown vineyard I have up and coming. So if you take a look at this vine here, this is growing in this pot here, and this will be part of the upcoming project. So there are varieties that you can get that are said to do well or do better in containers, more of a sort of restricted variety, if you will. So with regards to watering a grapevine that you've got growing in a container, twice a week would be great, and of course if it's drier than this, may have to water it more often. So just check the first few centimetres, the first inch or so, to make sure that that growing medium is not dry. Regarding the growing medium, you want something that is free draining, okay? You could maybe put some perlite in there or some horticultural grit, but you don't want to be putting, thick, heavy clay soil in there or anything like that. It's got to be free draining, okay? And regarding feeding, what you can do is at the start of the season you can put a balanced fertiliser in, ideally an organic one if you can. And of course, up until the fruit is ripened, you can feed with a fertiliser. You could use something like tomato feed if you wanted, every 2 weeks, to keep it simple. So of course this is a very immature specimen, but it's doing well. And what you'd want to do if you were growing a grapevine in a container is you want to limit it to 2 main shoots, okay? That way you're not overtaxing it, because of course it's got to get all its water and nutrients from the growing medium in the pot. So some people have asked me about fruit trees that aren't forming fruit. So fruit trees in general like at least 6 hours of full sunlight a day. So ideally more than that, 8 would be great, 10 would be brilliant. But that can't always happen. So go for at least 6 if you can, okay? And you don't want to be overfeeding, particularly with something like a high nitrogen content, because what that can then do is basically make the tree put out lots of leafy growth and not that much fruit, okay? So that's one thing that you can do. Of course, another thing is, like you saw the pear tree there, if you've got it in a very exposed position and wind is blowing all the blossom off, you might consider, I don't know, building a guard or something. I don't know if you remember that if you look around at orchards and places of old orchards, they used to put trees, poplar trees and things like that round as windbreaks to stop the wind from blowing the blossom off and thus potentially harming the eventual crop. Another thing you can consider doing is, maybe if you're getting late frosts that's damaging your crop, you can maybe consider a later flowering variety. So an example of this, we use pears again. If you're in an area where you get late frosts, there's a variety called Invincible. Now I've never owned this variety, I've just read about it, but apparently if it loses its first load of blossom, it then puts out another load. So that's something you may consider. Many of you are aware about the peaches and nectarines I've got growing in here in this polytunnel. And one thing about trees such as these is they blossom early. Now, if they're growing outside, frost damage, wind damage can blow it off and potentially damage the eventual crop. But in here, of course, it stops the wind from blowing the blossom off and keeps the frost off. So that's another option as well. Now, regarding blueberries, if you can, in fact I would say you must, have them in an ericaceous growing medium if your soil is not naturally that of a pH of 4.5 to 5.5. Once again, they like at least 6 hours of full sunlight a day. And again, at this time of the season, you want to be feeding with a balanced fertiliser, and every other week you want to be putting on a ericaceous drench. This is what I do anyway, and you can see they're looking quite healthy, looking very, very good there. And also what I'm doing is every 2 weeks, so I'm sort of like offsetting it, if you will, with the ericaceous feed. And what I'm doing is putting a balanced fertiliser on, so it's like a real consistent regime here. And what I also do is when I put the balanced feed on, or the liquid feed, the ericaceous liquid feed, I then don't water it the day after to make sure the plant fully absorbs that, so I don't wash it out the bottom. Now, when the fruits form on something like blueberries, you want to be watering them daily, okay? Blueberries in general are not deep rooted, even mature specimens, so you want to be watering them daily, and then that way you are more likely to get a good crop, because it's very, very stressful for the plant if it's not being watered every day, particularly when it's fruiting. So when talking about grapes, some people ask me about what is a good variety for them to grow, particularly if they're in maybe a northern part of the UK, a part where they don't get long warm summers like we hopefully will do, and do in the southeast here. Now, in general, if this is the situation, it's advised if you're going to grow on outside, you go for a white or green grape, okay? And you want to be making the most of your south-facing wall or fence for the microclimate. So there's so many different varieties out there that you can buy, and two varieties I've done very well with outside are Lakemont Seedless, you saw one of those earlier, and Muscat Blanc at a previous project. I can wholeheartedly recommend those varieties for this part of the UK. Now, if I was living in, say, Durham or Scotland, the Midlands, further north, where they generally don't get long and warm summers like we get here, I would go for a Lakemont Seedless, and I'd make sure if it was going outside it's up against a south-facing wall or fence to maximise the microclimate, or indeed another option is to grow one in a polytunnel or greenhouse, which must be unheated during the winter months because they need a dormant season in order to fruit. So that's one thing that I would consider doing. Now, if you want to grow a grapevine and you've got really claggy, heavy soil, okay, there's a few things you can do with this, okay? You can add organic matter. You can add something, maybe like a bit of perlite or horticultural grit, mix it all up, nice bit of organic compost, mix it up, get it all really, really nice, and then you could proceed to plant into that. Or if you're in an area where it's boggy and marshy or whatever, and that's just not practical, because grapevines will not tolerate really, really damp, soggy roots, okay? They just won't. So what you could consider doing then is growing one in a container, like I described earlier, in a 60-litre container is my recommendation. And I have seen them looking very, very healthy, really big vines in garden centres and things like that. People growing them in the half-wooden barrels, the whiskey barrels or beer barrels, whatever you want to call them. I've seen them growing very well in them, so that could be an option for you. But, research your varieties, but I can make a recommendation here of Lakemont Seedless for, growing outside, really. So, I was also asked a question about powdery mildew on squash plants. Now, this affects cucurbits, okay? So you've got marrows, courgettes, squashes, pumpkins and cucumbers, okay? They can be affected by powdery mildew, which is like a white stuff on the leaves. Now, the way you can deal with this, okay, is you can remove the bits of the plant as soon as you see them that are suffering from this and dispose of them accordingly. Don't put them in the compost bin, because if you do that, it can affect, subsequent crops. It can stay alive in there, so you don't want to be doing that. Now, I was also asked about, distancing of them. So the spores of that actually travel by air. So, of course, if they're, miles and miles, feet and feet, meters and meters apart, then they may not travel. But, even if you've got a fair distance, it could still travel. Now, it was intriguing, actually, because I did a little bit of research on the subject, and apparently mouthwash that, you use for, dental stuff in the evening or whenever, can be effective against that powdery mildew. So you want to do your own research on that. And I've also heard about people using, I think it was either bicarbonate or baking soda, something like that, as an effective treatment for this powdery mildew. So that might be something you can look into. Okay, so there we go. There's a little Q&A, and I intend to do more Q&A videos, and when I can budget the time, I want to do them, maybe a bit better than this. I'd like to do them, with the questioning on the screen and things like that. But of course, one's only got a certain amount of time they can put towards things like this, just how it is. But keep the questions coming, okay? I'm finding it very interesting answering them. What I do know, I will tell you, and what I don't know, I look up. So I think that it's very interesting for me and for you peeps as well. So I hope everybody out there is doing well. As always, if you like my work, please feel free to like, share and subscribe, and you can check me out on Dan_Home Gardens. See you in the next video.